my right, we have Mohsin Bhai, Mr. AKM Mohsin, who runs a Bangla newspaper called Banglar Konto, which is an immensely successful newspaper. But the key aspect of the newspaper, which really makes it stand out, not only in Singapore but in a global context, is that it's a newspaper that represents and recirculates the voices of Bangladeshi construction workers in Singapore. So it's a paper where you have Bangladeshi construction workers as reporters, as writers, as poets, but in the process then, Mohsin Bhai has actually been instrumental in creating a communicative space for Bangladeshi migrant workers as creative participants, helping us imagine them as more than workers, as more than blue-collar labor in the neoliberal economy of Singapore. Mohsin Bhai's work has led to various kinds of creative practices that have sort of been hosted and played out at various sites across Singapore, including performances by Bangladeshi workers, migrant poetry competitions. We now have the Singapore Migrant Poetry Competition that is attached to the Singapore Writers Festival. So really creating a space of legitimacy for migrant work, but from a very different lens of creativity and creative inputs. To my left, I have Sherry Sherqueshaa, who works with an organization called Project X. Project X does advocacy work with transgender communities and particularly with transgender sex workers, addressing issues of stigma that are experienced by transgender sex workers, but also trying to create a space where we can hear the voices of transgender sex workers, and in really developing advocacy tools that are rooted in the imaginaries that are put forth by transgender communities more broadly. Sherry's leadership is instrumental in working toward a space that is socially inclusive and that is represented through the voices of transgender community members. And to my very left, we have Mr. Jolovan Wham. Jolovan sort of is the face of activism in Singapore in many ways, and I think I would not be exaggerating if I said that Jolovan spearheaded the landscape, stands in as sort of a leader in the landscape of activism in Singapore. He represents an organization called Humanitarian Organization for Migrant Economics that advocates for migrant workers, primarily working with foreign domestic workers, but also with male construction workers, and really looking at advocacy as a site for policy change, taking up issues that are faced by migrant workers, but also trying in the process to change the policy landscape, which itself is a creative challenge within the context of Singapore. So look forward to hearing from you, Jolovan, about the kinds of challenges you face and how you work through these challenges. With this introduction then, our panel is academic activist partnerships in creating spaces for social change, the emphasis being on creating spaces for social change. The emphasis is going to be on Singapore, so it is contextual, but hopefully you can take away lessons that extend broadly to the region as well as to global networks. So let me open up the floor with Mohsin Bhai, and then we'll go to you, Sherry, and then to you, Jolovan.
Thank you very much. আমি একজন মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কার। আমি আমার ভাগ্য বদলের জন্য সিঙ্গাপুরে এসেছিলাম সেই 90 দশকের শুরু। এখানে এসে তখনকার দিনে মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কারদের এত বেশি সমস্যা ছিল না। সমস্যাটা শুরু হয়েছিল 90 দশকের মাঝামাঝি দিকে, যখন নন প্রফেশনাল এমপ্লয়ার যারা শুধুমাত্র শ্রমিকদের এনে এখানে শোষণের জন্য তারা কোম্পানি খুলে বিদেশি শ্রমিক এনেছে হিউজ পরিমাণে, তাদের কাজ 20 জনে তারা এনেছে 200, তখন তাদের কাজ দিতে পারে না, তখন থেকে সমস্যা শুরু হয়েছে। মূলত এভাবে সমস্যা গড়িয়ে এসে শুরু হয়েছে 2008-9 সালে বিশ্ব অর্থনৈতিক মন্দার সময়। এটা চূড়ান্ত পর্যায়ে আমরা দেখেছি। তো মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কার দিনে কাজ করতে গিয়ে এখানে আসলে প্রশাসনিক তেমন কোনো বাধাগ্রস্ত আমরা হয়নি, হয়েছে আমাদের নিজেদের মধ্যে যারা মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কার অ্যাক্টিভিস্ট বা মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কার অর্গানাইজেশন, তাদের মধ্যে খুব নীরব কাদা ছোড়াছুড়ি বা তাদের মধ্যে প্রতিযোগিতা, অসুস্থ প্রতিযোগিতা যাকে বলা যায়, শুধুমাত্র মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কারদেরকে ইউজ করে নিজস্ব ফেম নেম অর্জনের জন্যই তাদের এই কাজগুলো আমরা অবজার্ভ করেছি। বিশেষ করে আমার দেশের মানুষের জন্য, আমার দেশের মানুষ গরিব, তারা এখানে আসে কাজের জন্যে, ভাগ্য বদলের জন্য। এসে তারা এখানে প্রথম প্রতারিত হয়ে আসে তাদের নিজস্ব দেশের এজেন্টদের কাছে, দ্বিতীয়বার প্রতারিত হয়ে এখানে এসে তারা এমপ্লয়ারদের কাছে, থার্ড প্রতারিত হয় তারা এখানকার মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কার হেল্পিং গ্রুপ, তাদের কাছে হয় একরকম ইন্টেলেকচুয়াল এক্সপ্লয়টেশন। যাই হোক,
So I will translate this part and then Mohsin Bhai will keep going. So Mohsin Bhai came here himself as a migrant. He thinks of himself as a migrant worker. From the time that he came here in the 80s to the time in the 90s, when the economy started shifting in particular ways, he believes that the problems of migrant workers actually accelerated and started growing at an accelerated pace, with more and more instances of corrupt employers and corrupt business practices being documented, at least in the work that he does, where a company, for instance, would need only 200, would only need 20 workers, but would bring in 200 workers. Just like other migrant workers, he came here with many dreams. Workers usually come here with many dreams, and they come here to fulfill those dreams and expectations. He says that in working with the context of migration, what he's found that working with the state isn't as challenging as it is challenging to work across civil society and non-governmental organizations. He says that there are competing interests among non-governmental organizations, and this often becomes a source of trouble or a point of contention in working together in advocating for change. One of the things that he's particularly pointing toward is the ways in which Bangladeshi workers, for instance, because those are the workers that he works with that are poor, are exploited not only by the agent. So the agent is the recruiter when they are actually setting into the migration context in Bangladesh, but there is also usually an agent here in Singapore. So not only exploitation by the agent and exploitation by the employer. Okay, but something else he's saying is that the migrant worker is also exploited by civil society organizations, NGOs, and intellectuals that use migrant workers to earn their own name, fame, and accolades. So this is really powerful in terms of the kinds of things that we have been talking about so far. He's saying that in multiple instances what he's seen is that the condition of the migrant worker is exploited to serve personal agendas rather than really serving the goals and needs of the migrant workers themselves.
মূল প্রতিপাদ্য বিষয় ছিল মনে হয় যে আমরা কীভাবে সামাজিক পরিবর্তন আনতে পারি, যে আমরা যে কাজ করছি। সামাজিক পরিবর্তন আসে আসলে সম্মিলিত প্রয়াসের মাধ্যমে, যারা আমরা সত্যিকারভাবেই সমাজ পরিবর্তন বা আমাদের যে প্রান্তিক শ্রেণীর মানুষদের শুভ বা ভালোর জন্য কাজ করি, এই কাজগুলো আসে মূলত আমাদের সম্মিলিত প্রয়াস এবং কি বলে যে উদার মনে কাজ করা, কোনো প্রকার রিটার্ন না নিয়ে। তো এই কাজগুলো আমরা করছি, অনেকেই যার যার ক্ষেত্র থেকে করছে। যেমন বাংলা কণ্ঠ আমার একটা প্রতিষ্ঠান, এটা শুরু হয়েছিল 2006 সাল থেকে, আমরা 2016 সালে 10 বছর পূর্তি করছি। এর মাধ্যমে আমি যতটুকু করতে পেরেছি, আমি আমারটাই বলতে পারি যে আমি মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কারদের এখানে কোনো প্ল্যাটফর্ম ছিল না, কোনো মুখপত্র ছিল না। এটা শুরু করেছিলাম যে এই জন্যে যে তাদের মধ্যে যে লেক অফ কমিউনিকেশন উইথ দেয়ার কান্ট্রি অ্যান্ড ইনফরমেশন, যে এটা তখনকার দিনে সেই 90 দশকে তখন ছিল না, আজকের মতো মোবাইল ফোন এত অ্যাভেলেবেল ছিল না। তখন তার হাতে লিখতো, চিঠি লিখতো তাদের দেশে পরিবারের সাথে যোগাযোগের জন্য। তো তখন থেকে আমি কাজ শুরু করেছিলাম, যে তখন কোনো এনজিও এখানে ছিল না, মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কার হেল্পিং গ্রুপ কিছুই ছিল না সেই 90-91 সালে। তখন আমি স্টুডেন্ট হয়ে এসেছিলাম এখানে, আমার সাথে স্টুডেন্ট নিয়ে প্রতি রোববার আমার কান্ট্রিম্যানদের জন্য সারাঙ্গনে আমরা একটা নির্দিষ্ট জায়গা ছিল, ওখানে তারা আসতো, দেশ থেকে চিঠি এসেছে, কেউ চিঠির উত্তর লিখতে পারছে না, দেশের পরিবারের সমস্যাগুলোর কথা আছে চিঠিতে, এই চিঠিগুলো উত্তর লেখা, তারপর অনেকে লিখতে পারে খুব কম, এবং তাদের চিঠিগুলো পাঠাবার জন্য ইনকালাবের উপরে অ্যাড্রেস লিখতে হয় ইংলিশে, যেটা বাংলাদেশে যাবে। এই কাজগুলো শুরু করলাম সেই 91 সালে, 93, 94, 95, 96 এইভাবে আসলো, দিন গড়ালো। তখন দেখা গেল যে মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কারদের অন্যরকম সমস্যা শুরু হয়েছে। তখন মোবাইল ফোনের এত সমস্যা নেই, মোবাইল ফোন একটু অ্যাভেলেবল হচ্ছে। তখনকার সময় মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কার চিঠি লিখে যোগাযোগ করতে পারে পরিবারের সাথে, দেশের সাথে। তখন আমরা ওই শুরু হলো আবার আরেক রকম সমস্যা। তখন দেখা গেল যে তাদের ভাষা আছে, ভাষা প্রকাশের কোনো মাধ্যম নেই। এভাবে শুরু হলো আরেকটা অধ্যায়, যেখানে বাংলা কণ্ঠ বেশ অবদান রেখেছে অন্তত বাংলাদেশি মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কারদের ক্ষেত্রে, যেখানে মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কারদের তাদের মনের কথাগুলো, তাদের দুঃখের কথাগুলো, তারা স্বপ্ন নিয়ে এসেছে এখানে একটা সুন্দর স্বপ্নময় দেশে, তাদের স্বপ্নভঙ্গের কথাগুলো প্রকাশ মাধ্যম নেই। তখন সেই 2001 সাল থেকে প্রচেষ্টা শুরু, 2006 সালে এসে এই বাংলা কণ্ঠ, এইভাবে কীভাবে বাংলা কণ্ঠ প্রকাশিত হয়েছে, কীভাবে আমরা শুরু করলাম, যে এবং পরিবর্তনটা কীভাবে আসলো, যে ওয়ার্কাররা তাদের সর্বস্ব পৈতৃক সম্পত্তি পুরুষের বাড়ি বিক্রি করে এখানে এসে তারা তাদের রিটার্ন পাচ্ছে না। তারপর মানুষ তো শুধু যন্ত্র নয় যে কাজ করেই যাবে, কাজ করে যাবে, তাদের জন্য একটি বিনোদন, একটি অবকাশ দরকার। এই বিনোদনের মাধ্যম হিসেবে তারা বেছে নিতে তখন গ্যালাঙে যাওয়া, বা যখন ক্যাসিনো শুরু হলো ক্যাসিনোতে যাওয়া, কিন্তু জীবনের বাঁকা পথে হাঁটা। অনেকে আবার মাইগ্রেন্ট মেয়েদের সাথে গার্লফ্রেন্ড করা, কিন্তু এতে করে দেখা গেল যে ম্যাক্সিমাম ওয়ার্কারই তাদের যে অর্জিত অর্থরা হারাচ্ছে। তাদের কোনো বিনোদনের প্ল্যাটফর্ম নেই, না আমাদের দেশে সরকার করতে পেরেছে, না সিঙ্গাপুরের সরকার কোনো বিনোদন মাধ্যম তাদেরকে দিতে পেরেছে। তখন বাংলা কণ্ঠ একটা প্ল্যাটফর্ম গড়েছে, যে এখানে এসে তারা লেখালেখি করবে, নাটক করবে, তাদের নিজস্ব সংস্কৃতির চর্চা করবে, ভাষার চর্চা করবে, কবিতা লিখবে, গল্প লিখবে। এইভাবে বাংলা কণ্ঠ একটা বৃহৎ মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কারদের কমিউনিটিকে সম্পৃক্তি করতে সমর্থ হয়েছে বিগত 10 বছরে। এখন এটা হাজারো ছাড়িয়ে গেছে, যারা শুধু লেখালেখির মধ্যে সম্পৃক্ত, পাশাপাশি নাটক করা, গান করা, এটা আরও ব্যাপকভাবে হচ্ছে। এটাও আমি মনে করি আমাদের ক্ষেত্রে একটা পরিবর্তন, যে আমরা কিছুটা হলেও এই প্রান্তিক শ্রেণীটাকে সিঙ্গাপুরে এই একটা ঐশ্বর্যময় দেশে একটা প্রান্তিক শ্রেণীকে আমরা একটা প্ল্যাটফর্মে আনতে পেরেছি। এখন আপনি
So a little bit of a context first in terms of something that he had said earlier. He says that since 2008, the conditions of the migrant workers became even more troublesome in the context of the financial crisis and the economic problems that started arising, particularly with the solvency of companies. Then going forth, he's saying that the work that he started early on and the work of social change has to be carried out with a collective. It's really important that the various actors that are involved in this process come together as a collective in advocating for and working toward change. In this sense, then, what he outlines is a sense of commitment, a sense of passion, but more importantly, a sense of selflessness are really important, where one keeps the goals and the needs of the migrant worker at the focus rather than one's own needs for self-aggrandizement or progress with particular material indicators. Then he goes on to talk about his work with Bangla Kontho. When the newspaper started, it started with humble notion, and at that point there were not really helping lines and NGOs to work with migrant workers. And when he was initially doing this work, the work was pretty simple in the sense of writing letters, helping migrant workers, writing letters, making sure that they put the proper address to communicate with home. At that point, we didn't have mobile telephony the way in which we have it today. So writing letters became the way for the workers to communicate with their families and keep in touch with their families. That work then became the space gradually for the workers to start writing about other things, start writing about the issues they were experiencing, and led to the birth of Banglar Konto, which then became a platform for discussing, articulating, and voicing migrant worker issues. Now, what was really important about Banglar Konto was the way in which it created a creative platform. So he thinks of social change as the creation of a communication platform. Again, this is really relevant to the conversation we have been having, right? Mohsin Bhai says that the very creation of a communication platform for migrant workers where they could own their views and share them was the axis of social change, or maybe seen as social change. Today, this has grown to the extent that he has more than 1,000 migrant workers that contribute poetry, that contribute reports and news stories, that perform through songs and dances, that perform poetry sessions, and really creating a broader creative platform in Singapore. So what he hopes that through this work over the last decade, he's been able to achieve is to have created a platform that truly is a platform for migrant workers where we can hear their voices.
Thank you for sharing. So I will start by sharing with you all a few of the mission that Project Act does, and that is importantly for me is to increase sex workers' awareness towards towards abuse and violence by the members of society, and also by the law enforcer, the clients, and anyone who's potential of abusing them. Because we believe if you were to increase the awareness that the rights of the awareness, it will also increase the reports given by the sex workers to us, you know, how many clients abused them, how many police mistreated them. So this is for me the most important mission that Project X does. And how we get to do this is by human rights documentation and outreach, and also public education. For human rights documentation, we have this app called Abuser Alert, where sex workers can log into, and likewise, like any other police report, we Project X play the role as a police officer. We take down the location, the date, the time, and in details what had happened. So with this report, this documentation, we will spread it among our community, the sex workers community, and so that we can share, okay, look out for this person, okay, this is potential abuser. He will call you, he will offer you this price, and then end up he will maybe rob you or anything, you know. So with this, we can spread information to others among ourselves, because sex workers, being a sex workers, they are afraid to go to the police officer to report such cases, be it abusive or robbery, anything. So we playing the role as a police officer, we somehow make them feel more more fine, you know, like you don't feel like you're nothing, you know, sex workers are nothing, because we take the reports, we do something for them. You don't have to be afraid, we won't report them, we won't expose, oh, you're a sex worker, you deserve this happen to you, you know. So we play the role as a police officer. And on top of that also, we do outreach. We go to different locations to provide assistance. We provide the necessary stuff for sex work, condom, lubricant, wet wipes, and we also close the gap between sex workers, members of society, and the issues they have. We come to them, we talk to them, housework, you know, is there any cases, anything they want to share, anything they want to ask. So we not only look at them as a sex worker, we look at them as normal human being. You know, we ask them housework, because we believe sex work is also work, not just sex workers, right, but also sex work is a normal work and nothing to be ashamed of. And for public education, like what I'm doing now, you know, I attend courses, plenary session, I attend conference. We talk about the situation of sex workers in Singapore, the problems they face, the issue, and we share how we overcome, how we handle such issue. For example, like what I mentioned earlier on, abusive client. What we do, we have abuser alert, and for like also we also concerned about their health. We work hand in hand with AFA and organization that relating to HIV and AIDS. We not only concerned about their work safety, getting clients, also their health safety, giving condoms, free lubricant, and also we provide anonymous HIV testing. We tell them where to go to for HIV testing. So these are little things that sex workers don't know they are entitled to. They think they're just the minority marginalized community, and they are very vulnerable. They are doomed. If they are sex workers, then there's no point of living. There's no point of trying to make a change. So we are here to tell them that they still have a place to go. Project X is always here to provide the little things that they think they don't deserve, and that's very important. And for me, this is what drives me as a sex worker myself. I grew up not knowing that this thing is there. The resource is there. So I believe when you know there's a resource there, when you reach upon to them, you can make a change for yourself. For me, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I know nothing about safe sex, health screening, police brutality. I thought I deserve it. It's okay people to beat me up, to rob me. I deserve it. But when I know Project X, it shows that it's not the end. And I believe if I can change from knowing nothing and now being an activist, a Muslim activist, I'm proud to say that slowly, step by step, things can be changed. Okay, we are here to help them. So it all comes to a point where we can provide. Sex workers have to help us, have to work hand in hand with us, and in the future we all are aiming for that. If sex work becomes something that is nothing to be ashamed of, that members of society shouldn't be made fun of. They shouldn't disgrace us. And it's an endless journey which involves not only just sex workers but educating the public, so that not only you have that stigma that sex workers are dirty and stuff. I'm a sex worker, but at night I'm a sex worker, but in the daytime I'm an activist. I talk about human rights, I fight for their rights, and talking about human rights as an organization, talking about social change, it's something that when I say about human rights, people will just blank out. They say, oh, human rights, I'm a activist. They're just scared to talk to us, they're scared to approach us, scared to become a stakeholder. And it's also something that we hope to change, because human rights is something, for me, I find that people are scared to be involved with human rights, because it's like we are going against what's being stated by the government, like 377A, and the little things that's really fixed. We are trying to make a change, and this change are not a selfish change. It's something that is for the future of a sex worker. It's not because we don't encourage sex workers to happen, to continue as a livelihood. We are supporting them because there's always a reason why one do sex worker, and it's very important that in the future it has to be decriminalized, it has to be accepted somehow, at the stage of life, because it will never end. Because sex work is for me and for majority of them, it's a solution to earning. Because as a transgender, you can't work normal life, or maybe single parents, you have difficulty taking care for a child, and sex work is a flexible job, own time, own target. It's still a honest living. You don't rob, you don't cheat your money. It's a thing that you do out of your own will. And these are the changes I believe could be changed in the future with more accepting, more advocating and educating. And it's something that I still strive to, and I can confidently say, for now, being with this, I know more, and slowly I'm departing from being sex work to become a full-time activist, because I realized that it takes one to change the whole community. For me, I will speak up for the transgender community, sex worker, and with me, you see, not knowing anything, I become something new, and it gives me the motivation that if I can change myself, I also can change others. If others will work hand in hand, we all can change what the cisgender community are looking upon us as sex workers, transgender sex workers. And it's a very important thing that we shouldn't stop or shouldn't give up at all.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'll talk about home and how we started and what are some of the programs and services we offer. We established in 2004, and we didn't start out actually wanting to be an advocacy or an activist group. Yeah, what happened was that we saw that there was a need, a very basic need, which was a shelter, yeah, for migrant workers, because we were seeing quite a number of migrant workers without any places to live in, or who dared not, or domestic workers who dared not leave their employers' houses because there was just nowhere for them to stay if they were to file a complaint. Yeah, so it was in response really to a very basic need, which was that migrant workers needed a shelter to live in. So, so we started out very much like a direct services organization. But as we did our work, we also realized that a lot of the problems and issues and challenges that these workers were facing is due to a lot of discrimination, and a lot of this discrimination and exploitation was happening because of inadequate protection. And so this led us to feel that we had to do a lot more in terms of advocacy, so that these laws and these policies would change, and that workers would have access to justice. When we started Home, we were aware that migrant workers' issues were quite sensitive, so that's why we didn't call ourselves migrant workers. We really used the word rights, for instance, in the way we described our work. So if you notice, Home's name is Humanitarian, right? So we call ourselves a humanitarian organization because this would make it more likely for the organization to be registered. And our objectives, even if you look at our objectives now in our constitution, it's all very innocuous. Yeah, we talk about things like alleviating crisis, education, integration, services. Yeah, so it's just how you play with the language, I suppose. Yeah, so we didn't have any trouble registering. We had to wait a few months, but that was quickly resolved, and then we started our work. And then one of the things that we were pushing quite hard on was equal protection for migrant domestic workers. So even though Home, we serve foreign workers like Bangladeshi workers, construction workers, shipyard workers, a lot of our emphasis is also on migrant domestic workers and the fact that they need to have equal rights. So domestic work, even though it's something which is officially recognized by the state, but it does not have official recognition in terms of protection. Yeah, so domestic workers can be on standby 24 hours a day, yeah, and that is perfectly legal. So we all take for granted our weekly days off, our public holidays, our annual leave, our sick leave, but domestic workers are denied these kinds of protections. So this is one of the key things which we are fighting, Home is fighting for in relation to domestic workers, is to ensure that they have the same kinds of rights that all other employees have. But the challenges we face, a lot of it is because many employers, many Singaporeans are against this idea that domestic workers should have equal rights. Yeah, so for instance, the right to have a weekly day off. This was something which met with a lot of resistance when we started that campaign together with TWC2 and UN Women. So even though it has been legislated, but there's still a lot of resistance on the ground, and there are a lot of loopholes in the law. So employers can easily pay a domestic worker a compensation of just $20, $30 just to persuade her not, to pressurize her not to take that day off. And if any domestic worker who tries to assert her right to a weekly day off, she runs the risk of being sent back. So even though we have a law that says, yeah, you have the right to a weekly day off, but in reality the enforcement is very weak, and many domestic workers still don't have that right. So how we try to organize around this issue is to get the domestic workers involved, and this is something which we have started to do in the last few years, and that has been particularly challenging as well. Domestic workers, for instance, they don't even really have their weekdays, their weeknights off. So most of us, we start our jobs at 9, we finish at 6, then we meet our friends for dinner, and then we do what we want, right? But domestic workers, that's not how their workday is structured. So they start at 5, 6 in the morning and finishes at 9, 10 at night. And even to leave the house to do something, they need permission. And getting, for instance, like today's talk, there was a domestic worker who was supposed to come to speak, but then at the last minute, her employer wanted her to do her work, so she wasn't able to come. So these are the kinds of challenges, because if you are an exploited, disempowered class in the first place, so then how do you even create that space to empower a marginalized group? Which is why for us the day off was very important, because if you don't even have that day off, you don't even have that free time to do something, how do you seek help? How do you organize? How do you even empower yourselves? So, but we have been fortunate in the sense that we have a group of domestic workers who are very kind, generous employers who let them out on Sundays, and some of them can even come out on Saturdays. So they do a lot of volunteer work with us. So they are the ones, so we train them on Singapore's laws, we train them on human rights issues, so that other migrant workers who need help, they are the ones who are there on Sunday to provide advice and to assist them. But it's difficult, because even when we want to get migrant workers to speak at a public forum, politically this is also risky for them. And we've also had employers of our volunteers who are a bit wary sometimes when we get them involved in campaigns. They will say things like, will this affect my worker's work permit? Will the Ministry of Manpower be angry that she's doing something like that? So we have to deal with all these fears and concerns. Last year we started a petition to get the government to enact a victim-centric anti-human trafficking law. So this petition was to be signed by everyone: migrant workers, Singaporeans, employers. The migrant workers, when we presented the petition for them to sign, many of them were afraid to sign it, because they thought that they might not be able to continue working in Singapore if they wrote their names down and their identification numbers and all that. So in the end, we had to compromise, because the petition, according to the standing orders in Parliament, you're supposed to have the name and the address and the signature. So, but many of them were afraid of disclosing their address where they lived. So they just put their names and they signed. And when migrant workers, I think when foreigners actually, if you want to speak in a public talk, you're supposed to get a permit, you're supposed to get a license. So that makes it also difficult, to get migrant workers to speak at public forums and to represent themselves on these kinds of issues, because there's always that fear hanging over their heads. Is that something going to happen to my employment? So from the perspective of a Singaporean activist, because I feel that ideally I shouldn't be the one sitting here talking about these issues. It should be the migrant workers themselves. But given these kinds of restrictions, given these kinds of fears which we have to respect, what are the kinds of spaces that NGOs like Home can create, for these workers to represent themselves? If you look at Hong Kong, for instance, migrant workers, they can unionize, they go on demonstrations, and they pretty much say, represent themselves on all these issues. And I've been very inspired when I meet many of the domestic workers who are activists in Hong Kong. And I look at the situation here in Singapore, and I think to myself, okay, how much more we have to catch up in terms of getting the migrant workers themselves being able to represent their own issues. So, like for instance, there are domestic worker unions in Hong Kong, but in Singapore, migrant workers can't even form their own unions, because the government doesn't want foreign interference in domestic affairs. So even a registered society like Home, we can only have Singaporeans and PRs who are on our executive committee. So we can't have migrant workers on our executive committee. So which means it's always the Singaporeans, the PRs, the ones who are so-called more empowered, who are speaking for them. So I just thought I'll just end here, and I believe there's a lot to chew on, based on what we all have shared.
Thank you so much, all three of you. At this point, let's turn the floor to questions and discussion, and then we will take it back again and discuss some key issues. So do you have any questions at this point from the audience?
My name is Sia. Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you very much for the staff for sharing your stories. My name is Sierra.
mostly from Indonesia, from Jakarta, and mostly I'm working in the HIV field for a long time. So this is kind of close to my heart. But then taking into account what I've been hearing for the last few days, where we have been theorizing a lot about communication for social change. So I would like you to ask all of you here in the panel, what do you think is the role of academics? We've been theorizing a lot for the past few days. What is the role of all these theories that we've been talking about, conceptualizing? What is the role of all that to your work in the field? Especially, for example, if you're a member of the community, you cannot retract yourself from your community, especially if your heart is there. If you're an activist, you cannot retract yourself from the work, from the problem itself, because you're part of the solution making there. But as an academician, at some point you have to retract yourself to a certain level. So, what is the role of academics with all this situation that you see will be useful for you? Because at some point someone will say, that's all theory, that's not field. Whatever you can say at the university, it's not the same. It's not the same as what we are feeling on the field work. So, do you think there's any added value that you felt or you have experienced so far from this synergy between academics and activists and community members so far? Thank you.
I think, okay, I'll just talk about the Singapore context. What's missing in Singapore is the academic activist. I think there are a lot of academics who I don't know, it seems like we don't have a very strong public intellectual kind of culture or discourse here in Singapore. And academics, I believe themselves are also quite afraid, of speaking up and researching on issues which are sensitive. I'll give one example, which was several years ago when we did our Day Off campaign. We approached some academics at NUS to spearhead this research because we really wanted data, quantitative data, to examine the working conditions of domestic workers and the Day Off issue. And they were not keen to pick it up. And the sense we got was that this was going to be a very sensitive issue. So they were afraid that if they were to embark upon it, it might have repercussions for them. And even when we did finally manage to get academics, and this time we approached SMU to do it, the academics who were involved in it also had to be quite careful, in terms of how they positioned the paper, what they wanted to say, etc. So there were lots of all these political considerations that they had to make. So which was also a challenge, I think, for us in terms of wanting to get academics more involved in the work that we want to do. But there's certainly a lot that academics can offer, especially when you look at how the Singapore government works. They always want hard data. Yeah. If you do a qualitative study, they'll be like, oh, it's just a few people. So what's the big deal? Yeah. So this is what we often get when we meet policymakers at MOM. But if you do a huge study with 1,000 people, then they take it more seriously. So there's also that kind of bias, I think, in government when it comes to what kind of research they take seriously. And the MOM themselves, I think last year they conducted this satisfaction survey. They wanted to find out how many foreign workers were satisfied working in Singapore. So they found out 9 out of 10 were satisfied. So they got this marketing company, to do it for them. And they had a sample of, I think, 2,000 workers. Yeah, and I'm like, 2,000 workers, how am I going to find, people to interview 2,000 workers? Yeah, but they will use that. They'll say, yes, you see, we interviewed 2,000 people. Yeah, how many do you have? 300, 400? So this is where I think academics can come in with their knowledge, their skills in terms of helping us design our research so that it's credible, so that we have numbers and reliable data to present to them and say that things need to change. Of course, research by itself doesn't change things. It's what you do with the research. And what home we do is we take this data, we put it into our advocacy documents, we lobby the UN, we lobby governments, we publicize it, we talk to unions and other partners and try and push out to parliamentarians so that the laws and the policies can change. So, and it's only with good, strong evidence that we are able to do that. And this is where I think academics can play a very important role.
একাডেমিক রিসার্চাররা যে কোনো সমাজে যে কোনো দেশে বিরাট ভূমিকা রাখতে পারে এবং এটাই হলো যে সমাজ পরিবর্তন তার দিক নির্দেশনা দিতে পারে। এখানে হয়তো বাধাবিঘ্ন থাকতে পারে সরকারি পক্ষ থেকে, প্রশাসনিক পক্ষ থেকে, তাহলে তো আর পুরো জিনিসটা একাডেমিক বা রিসার্চের জন্য সরকার বা প্রতিষ্ঠান, ওই সরকারি প্রতিষ্ঠানগুলোকে ফান্ড দিচ্ছে সরকারি, আর যদি তাদেরকে স্বাধীনতা না দেওয়া হয় তাহলে তো এখানে একটা ডাবল একটা স্ট্যান্ডার্ড হয়ে গেল, আমরা ফান্ড দিচ্ছি আবার এই করতে পারবো এই করতে পারবো না, তাহলে তো এটা মূল উদ্দেশ্যতে এখানে ব্যাহত হওয়ার কথা। আর একাডেমিকরা যেটা সমাজ সমস্যা, অর্থনৈতিক সমস্যা, সংস্কৃতির সমস্যা, একটা সমাজ নিয়েই তো মানুষকে নিয়ে সমাজ, মানুষের জন্যই সব গবেষণা সব কিছু। তো একাডেমিকরা যেটা গবেষণা করে যেটা বের করে আনবে সমস্যা, তো এটা বাস্তবায়ন সরকার যদি না করে, যে কোনো দেশ, সিঙ্গাপুর নয়, বাংলাদেশ নয়, ইন্ডিয়া নয়, এটা সব দেশ সব সমাজের কথা আমি বলছি, যেখানে কোনো পলিসি চেঞ্জ করলো না, এই রিসার্চ বা এটার আউটকাম যা আসলো, এটা অ্যাক্টিভিস্টরা এটা আদায় করে নিতে পারে, অ্যাক্টিভিস্টরা এটা নিয়ে কাজ করতে পারে, সমাজের প্রতি স্তরে স্তরে মানুষকে সচেতন করার জন্য, এটা যাতে সরকার বাস্তবায়ন করে। আর সর্বোপরি বলতে হয় যে রিসার্চ একাডেমিটা করবেন এটা কাদের জন্য? মানুষের জন্য, মানুষের প্রয়োজনে। তো মানুষের প্রয়োজনে করতে গিয়ে যদি এটার কোনো ফলপ্রসূতা না থাকে, তো এটা কেন করা? এটা কি শুধু আমি রিসার্চ করে আমি ডক্টরেট হব এটার জন্য করা, নাকি মানুষের উপকারের জন্য, সমাজ পরিবর্তনের জন্য করব? আমি একটু ব্যতিক্রম কথাই সবসময় বলি যে আমি আমার 10 বছরের অভিজ্ঞতায় এই সিঙ্গাপুরে দেখেছি অনেক স্টুডেন্ট, অনেক ছাত্রছাত্রী, অনেক একাডেমিকরা এসেছেন আমার কাছে। আমি রিসার্চার নই, আমি একাডেমিক নই, আমি একজন মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কার, আমি অ্যাক্টিভিস্টও নয়, আমি সিভিল সোসাইটি নয়। আমি দেখেছি তারা এসেছেন শুধুমাত্র তাদের ভান্ডার পূর্ণ করার জন্যে, তাদের ডক্টরেট নিয়ে তারা বড় বড় চাকরি পেয়েছেন। কিন্তু আমার মাইগ্রেন্ট ওয়ার্কারদের কি হলো? তাদের তো কোনো পলিসি চেঞ্জ হলো না, তাদের তো ঠিকই তারা আগের মতো এক্সপ্লয়েট হচ্ছে, এক্সপ্লয়েটেশনের সিস্টেম পাল্টাচ্ছে। যারা এক্সপ্লয়েট করে তাদের এক্সপ্লয়েটেশনের কি বলে পথ, তারা নতুন নতুন পথ বের করে এক্সপ্লয়েটেশন ঠিকই চালিয়ে যাচ্ছে, এক্সপ্লয়েটেশন বন্ধ হচ্ছে না। মানুষের জন্য যদি হয় তাহলে মানুষের প্রয়োজন হবে, আমার ব্যক্তি প্রয়োজন হবে কেন? আমি এইটুকুই আমার যতটুকু বুঝে আমি বললাম।
Mohsin Bhai is saying that academics in any society have a big role to play in studying social problems and hopefully in helping shape policies based upon the research that they do. He's also saying that in any country, the role of the state is to support academia by offering it resources. So it's quite a paradox when there are limits imposed on academia in terms of what you can and cannot study. So academics need to have the kind of freedom in studying the kinds of social problems that are important to communities. He is more importantly saying that academic research can play an important role in throwing light on social problems and helping them actually solving the needs of the people. At the end of the day, similar to what Jolovan is saying, academic research can actually make an impact in improving the conditions of the lives of the people. That should be the goal of academic research. But he's saying, unfortunately, over the last 10 years that he's worked, he doesn't think of himself as an activist or a civil society worker. He's a migrant worker in this sense. But he said that he's seen many academics come and go using migrant workers as data banks, gathering data from them, publishing articles, publishing their dissertations, and making a career, filling own bhandar, filling their own coffers. That would be the translation of it. But not doing anything at all for migrant workers. So the exploitation of migrant workers has continued. You have academic papers that have been published one after the other, but that hasn't changed the exploitation of migrant workers. That's because academics care about filling their own coffers and not about really doing work that improve the conditions and lives of the workers. Sherry, did you want to add?
It is true, we get a lot of academics who email us asking for access to the workers that we house and wanting interview subjects. So we used to just allow that, but now we have changed tack. So what we're saying is, if you want to do a research paper, then you will have to turn that into an advocacy document for us, which we are able to use and to publicize. So which means you have your own dissertation, but you also have to write a separate piece for us so that we can use that data. And we will also ask them to pay the workers that they interview. Each one must have like an allowance or stipend.
So you have a gatekeeping process.
Yes, that's right.
Elaine and then Elin.
Hi, I have a question for Mohan about how do you I see your work clearly has been aligning with activists, but one of the questions I often receive from students is, can good academics at the same time be an activist? And with these two different, it's almost like, can a judge be an activist? If we're thinking about, somebody who needs to somehow speak of the truth and a solution, and at times being neutral in finding the policy that works not for one particular group but for everybody. How do you position or see good academics in this a world that clearly needs activists? And then my second question is sort of in relation to the activists on the panel, about how do you feel when you invite academics coming in to study your environment, and clearly these are the marginalized group that often are voiceless. But at the same time, there may be problems within these groups that can be damning. So for example, this time when I was doing my Fulbright research with immigrant workers, clearly I see a lot of things that's not right, social injustice done to them, and they need to fight back. But a very minor theme that I have seen also is that the immigrants also themselves talking about blackmailing their own employers by claiming or manipulating their own injuries, or setting up their employer to be filmed in a certain way that allow them to gain privileges. And from a researcher's perspective, I think this is a very interesting story in the backdrop of how these immigrants or migrant workers are being abused in many ways. And so as a researcher, I decided not to pursue this story, because I think if this story or publication is published, it's almost it would damage all the effort to help migrant workers. But this also, at the same time, doesn't take away the fact that these are important aspects of. I don't want to romanticize the marginalized, but at the same time, I don't know how activist group feel about, because I imagine if I write this, it would be a huge betrayal to all these activists' work. But not to talk about this at all, at the same time, I think it's not being fair to what is true out there. So I would like to see how the activist group feel about academics' role, which may or may not align with your policy positions.
Eileen, thanks for that great question. You know, the first thing I want to do is to use a qualifier to say, I don't think of myself as an academic activist. I see that academic hyphen activist as an invitation to collaborate with activists and to really learning from them. And that's a humbling process, you know, to learn from each of these collaborators. Now, my approach to research in this sense is to begin with the notion that research is politics, and any form of knowledge production is a political formulation. So once I begin with that stance, it sort of relieves me of the notion that I'm here to pursue objective knowledge. I think of my work as participating in the production of knowledge in collaboration with groups that are at the margins, in collaboration with civil society actors, political society activists, with the agenda of bringing about transformations in structures. So I guess the challenge there then lies in how do you negotiate between what you produce in a white paper, right, Jolovan, that is directed at a different audience. When we run a survey of migrant construction workers and their problems with food, that is clearly directed at a broader audience and as a policy advocacy tool, vis-a-vis when I'm publishing for a journal. And what I believe needs to happen, at least in my own work that I'm struggling to work with in that sense, is to create space in academia, within journals, for acknowledging that any form of academic production is a particular kind of politics. And then by making explicit my politics to this work, I then render open that space for what we will call as co-construction under the culture-centered approach, which is that I put my ideology, my ideological commitments on the table. You see the ideological commitments of the community within that context, and then how these are negotiated. So the process of negotiation in that sense becomes visible. I would say, of course, you can never make it transparent in a way that this then becomes reality, right? But it is a movement toward describing my commitments working in hand with commitments of the community. Within that sense, then I think there needs to be, and this is why I go back to Mohsen Bhai's point, I think too much of academia has been sort of limited in the ivory tower with this notion of objectivity. To the extent that, in fact, you know, going back to Jolovan's point, I recently had a senior colleague comment, you know, you spend so much time out in the community doing this work, it doesn't look serious enough. As if the burden of seriousness is tied to some kind of disconnect. And that goes back to your point, this point of pulling away. We, I think, place too much value in this notion that one has to pull away, and by pulling away, somehow one can come up with concrete, objective realities. While the fact is that the very act of pulling away can take one further away from the truth if we are in the quest for truth. And let me give you an example. I have seen multiple instances where, say for instance, an academic has a team of research assistants. The research assistants or the academic are not familiar in the local context of the work, say with migrant construction workers. They have paid Mohsen Bhai, okay, who then carries out their work. He gathers the data. So these academics have no idea about the community and the context. So they would argue that that is all fine because they are being objected. But they haven't even cared to travel to the context and the community to understand it, right? And then they take the data that is produced by Mohsen Bhai. He has done the interviewing, the transcribing, they analyze it up, and they write up a journal. And this is what I think he's talking about, where they gain their own accolades, right? So it is extractive. But beyond that, I would say it is also poor scholarship. Because what we have here is academic work that is superficial, that is not really connected to or embedded in the lives of the community with an attempt to even understand it from the standpoint of the community. So I think if we sort of take this logic, we have to begin by starting to question what goes on in the name of academic work, and a lot of what we see as poor quality academic work, where, I talk about this as academic tourism. You have scholars from London, from New York flying in, spending 5 days gathering their data, going back, and then so all of a sudden you have a migration expert in Australia that's apparently a migration expert on the lives of migrant construction workers. And if you ask them, how much time, I go back to the point I raised earlier, if you ask them how much time have you spent, and the answer is that they have spent very little time. So this is the kind of shoddy scholarship that often goes on, and I think that was, I go back to Dr. Shom's point about with cheap empiricism, or with light empiricism that really is not committed to understanding what is going on in the field. So within these structures, then I think there is, in some way, we each have to play advocacy role in, so the advocacy is not just for you out in the communities, also for us within institutions. It is for me within NUS to work on these structures about what NUS thinks about as acceptable scholarship and what are the realms of acceptable scholarship.
I will respond to your point about how NGOs feel about data that doesn't help them, right? As a service provider, we see our share of workers who lie, who make false claims, whether they're false injury claims or false abuse claims. So I know what you're talking about, and these are of course the kinds of stories which we wouldn't want to highlight. But I think it's also important to contextualize and understand why these lies and these false claims are being made. So I have seen Bangladeshi workers, for instance, who make false work accident claims because they feel because their employer is not able to give them a job and wants to send them back, right? So the only way in which they can prolong their stay in Singapore is to create this story, and to tell a lie against the employer. So I see a lot of these kinds of things actually as acts of resistance and also as adaptation. I mean, true, there are dishonest people. I mean, we don't want to romanticize migrant workers because they're human beings too, and so human beings come in all shapes and sizes. But in order to make this paper, which you talked about, something which could be relevant from an activist point of view, really to look at the social, political conditions in which these kinds of decisions are made. I think that would be a lot more helpful, and it would draw more insights and throw light on why they are saying these things and making things up.
Yeah, and to answer Lynn's question, I think even as a research method, for me the simple solution, if it's a solution, is to go and talk to the person who has lied to you to say whether this is publishable or writable, and you get the answer from there. Because in more often than not, they will tell you what they want out of telling that to you.
Oh, no, they did not lie to me. It was just that they were talking about stories of workers faking, and I absolutely agree with you that they just wanted a day break. So there are very good structural injustice reasons for that to happen. But at the same time, I'm just wondering, even if it was positioned in a way of saying that there are larger injustice, why not become an act of resistance? It may still reinforce stereotypes.
Yes. I have a question for Sherry. Can you just take us through the formation of Project X? Just take us through that. And my second question is, because you mentioned a very interesting example of the sex abuser hotline. I'm very curious. I mean, how did you think up this solution? Who thought it up? You know, I'm really curious as to when you find solutions like that, whether it's you and your fellow colleagues who think up these solutions. Thank you.
So yeah, it's called a wizard alert, and because we are the front person of Project X, since we are close contact with them, and initially all about like just sharing, hey, you know what happened, Sherry, yesterday this guy he punched me, he doesn't want to pay me, and then you know they are just like expressing out to me, and it may seem a minor thing, you know, but if you were to really look at where they're coming from, they're trying to express and wanting something to happen. This can be little, but those major things like if escort sex workers, they go to this client's house or hotel, and recently there's also a case where this client, he robbed the sex worker cash and valuables, and this sex worker is hopeless, like she has not she can't do anything because she know she did a crime, which is soliciting, you know, so she just keep it to herself. And with these little things, we realize that police officer won't do much, won't be helpful. They're not kind to take genuine response of the report. So we come up with whatever they need to do, whatever police do, we do, you know, taking details of it, and what we importantly emphasize is that we assure them that we assure that whatever they tell us will be very resourceful in the future. It will be shared among others, you know, because after all, sex work and the community is a small community, you know, everyone know where the red district is, where to get them, how to get in touch with them. So it's a thing that among ourselves, if we don't educate ourselves, we don't share what happened, you know, it may be get out of hands. So by one person sharing, you know, it make a comfort zone where like example, this person tell me, so then this person tell the friend, hey, you know, Project X did help me something. They listen to me, they listen to my problem, they consult me what to do in the future if it happens again, you know, and it spreads around. It's not just from me and the person, it becomes a passing thing, you know, like she tell her friend tell another friend, like, oh, okay, now they know, okay, Project X can do this, not just condoms. They take our reports, they help us to consult us, you know, and yeah, that's why it's important, and it's something that we are very proud of, and I'm sure there's more to do. It's not just and there, not just a visual alert, and I'm sure in the future there's more to it. And if I forgot to say that with this report, we will annually present it to different stakeholder, maybe antivirus whatever, or the police department, and say, look, this is the annual report of reports made to us that they can't come to you all, because why? Your officer, your police officer won't take it seriously, because commonly they will say it's your fault because you're a sex worker, because you dress skimpily, that's why you get molested, you get raped, you get disturbed, because you know, and this is not the right reason why sex workers can't come to you. So with this report, we backlash to them back. You know, this is not a very little things that you should neglect, because look at how many numerous reports there is. You know, it's a hard evidence. It's not something that we rack up. It's from them itself, because we have their contact details, IC number, where it happens. It's not something that we are Project X doing to show that we are doing something as an organization. We are their voices. We are their helping hand. And then it comes back to, I just remember that talking about academic, you know, academic, like I have students coming up to me wanting to interview older transgender sex worker, and it's a very common thing that keep on happening every single day. And we also realize that they will always ask the same question. So what we do in Project X is that we will write in our website the common question and the common answer. So those possible questions, like, okay, those are the questions are available in the website. So it saves us the damage of, you know, exposing our sex workers to them, because sex workers are very vulnerable. If you were to ask me, I would share everything, you know, and then you will leak out secrets like lies, hidden stories, and then it's between them, between the sex workers and the researcher. and we can't control what the researcher can post or cannot post. Even if the researcher don't post, they can share it among other friends, and then it creates another speculation of stigma, assumption, judgment. So we try to avoid, we're not restraining, but we try to avoid close contact between the sex workers and researcher, not because they're selfish, but for their own safety. We wouldn't want them to expose and share so much. So we, as the third party or the voice, we provide it on our website, because they will always have the same question, same story, and it will be the same answer, different. And obviously they're just doing it for thesis or for final year project, and it doesn't go anywhere from there. Seriously speaking, it doesn't go far from there. You just end there. So some sex workers ask me, what happened after that? What are they gonna do with it? And then for me, when they ask me, I feel ashamed, because honestly, I myself know you go nowhere. So that's why I avoid involving them in the academic work, because they feel, when you ask them questions, they feel a ray of hope that something might change, not just Project X, but from NYP, NUS, SP, this kind of education. So they are hoping for things, and these transgender sex workers or sex workers, they don't really know what is it for. They are blind, maybe they're just being manipulated, sugar coated. Oh, it's for to share, and then where else it's not to share, it's just for the work only, for the purposes, And it really upset me that to see them being so positive to share. Oh, I want to share, I don't mind. No, if there's no monetary involved, it's okay. As long as I can share my experience, as long as I can do something. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the report, it's just nothing. Out of 10, maybe 2 or 3 only will come back to us and say, oh, okay, this is a compilation of report of the thing we made, and not all will come back to us, and then we also feel disappointed, and it makes us feel demoralized to work again in the future with different academic holder or researcher, because we don't want to same thing to happen again, like no fruitful outcome of it.
Thank you. Wajia.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated all of you sharing from such worthy causes, and I think something that I appreciate so much from a medical perspective is that the word culture has created a safe space. And when we talk about owning our ground, I feel that this word culture has helped us as academics to kind of legitimize a lot of the issues that we can raise. One of the challenges that I face from the medical field, as well as because in medicine not everybody is a researcher, one of the struggles that I face personally is that all these are social justice issues which we really grapple with, which are real. May I ask for your advice from your experience in this with such delicate issues in society, especially from a Singaporean framework, which Jolovan, you rightly mentioned that a lot of times there's a lot of fear, anxiety, and treading over certain issues. What would your advice be to encourage academics or our juniors or scholars to continue to move in this area? And what would be your advice with regards to not overstepping boundaries, so as not to jeopardize the good work that a lot of you front runners have painfully kind of blazed the trail ahead for us?
Well, you talk about boundaries and how not to transgress them, right? I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that. I guess you won't know you crossed it until you're told. And this, I think, involves some kind of risk, and I think in the work that we all have done when we have crossed that boundary, we've had our risks slapped, but I think, I don't know, I mean, in the many times in which our risks have been slapped, nothing really serious has happened. I mean, this is not like Hong Kong, right, where you get spirited away because you open a bookstore and you're selling publications which criticize the mainland Chinese communist regime. So it's a kind of different context that we have here. So I don't think that the risks for me, they're not that great. But having said that, I think it certainly helps if people come together when you band together. Say, for instance, you talk about medical practitioners, right? If you're a doctor, and you find in your conversations with other doctors that you're seeing these kinds of issues like access to health treatment, there's a lot of injustice there. So I think it helps if doctors, say, organize themselves, and they just come together as a group. Maybe they write a paper, or they bring up their concerns to the ministry, etc. I think all these little things do help, and if you are doing on your own, you will always feel that you are fighting this battle, a solo battle. Yeah, and there is a lot of, but when you work together as a team, there is solidarity, there is safety in numbers. I think this helps push the issues forward better, rather than if you are operating on your own and you run the risk of perhaps losing your job or affecting your promotion, etc. So, and it also helps if you join, say, an organization or an association that's dealing with these issues. Yeah. So then there is a larger body that can represent the interests that you're concerned about. Yeah. So I mean, this is my off-the-cuff response to the question.
I want to go back to this idea, and I think you rightly put it, that culture, at least I find that as an academic, culture offers me the space to talk about issues of structure and economic marginalization, or also find ways of bringing those in through narratives and stories, and bringing those forth, right? The other part of it also, Ajay, I want to sort of talk about is, it seems to me, and only been, so this is my 4th year, it's in Singapore, but it seems to me that the notion of risk and the perception of risk is exaggerated in academia in Singapore. So there is a certain kind of posturing that goes with it. So I have heard academics, I don't want to come to Singapore because, they will put me in jail if I do this kind of work. But that's really exaggerated. That really is portraying sort of an extreme, and which then leads people to self-censor. Meaning that if you haven't, and I like what Jolovan said, you would only know the boundaries, whether it is in Singapore or anywhere else. We always work with structures. When we are trying to publish, we are working across structures, within structures, with structures. You would know how far you have gone, and you can test the waters only by doing it, only by practicing it. So I really worry about this culture of self-censorship. So in some ways, my advice to junior colleagues also is to be more bold.
Thank you.
Barbara?
Well, just a follow-up to your comment and Wai's question, could you share, given the experiences you've had bumping up against structures, a strategy or two that helped you to proceed or advance?
Yeah. I will talk about from an academic standpoint, and then Jolovan, I'm sure you have had more experience as you, Mohsen Bhai or Sherry. I'll talk about our food rights project, right? So when we started working with food rights, and we started doing in-depth interviews, and the workers said that they wanted to talk about food. The first thing we came across, in fact, was, and you remember this, Mohsen Bhai, I think, an NGO partner telling us that, this issue will not even see the light of the day. And I think those research assistants that are around the table that were there at that time, they remember that conversation, And then we had to creatively think about what kinds of strategies we would need to put into place for this to see mainstream discourse, to talk about issues of migrant construction workers, food being a key issue. And this goes back to Jolovan's point, and this is the strategy that the workers themselves suggested, is that why don't we present numbers? You have access to research, why don't you do your research and present numbers? So Barbara, for us that was a strategy. was to go gather quantitative data, which then helped us substantiate the stories and document what? It was 94-95% of workers that said they experienced bad food, unhygienic food at some point of time or the other. And that then became a headline story. But you see, it became a story. And then we did get a call from the ministry, right? One of the key stakeholders asking about how we had gathered the data. But we could then go back to our, this goes back to your point, Jolovan, right? About your method and the credibility of your method, about our sampling strategy and how we had sampled, laying out your limitations, but also saying that this is what the data happened to state. So I think that's one of the creative strategies for us, was to go to legitimacy of numbers and quantitative research, and this goes back to the discussion yesterday. The other thing also is to find creative language and to find collaborative spaces. So in that sense, with the Food Rights Project, then one of the next steps was to actually work with various stakeholders, including the state as an actor at the table, to try to look at how do you create solutions, so that the part of the ownership of solving the problem is also shared with the role of the state and structures of governance in addressing it, so that it's not just an antagonistic relationship, but it is a co-creative, collaborative relationship in addressing the need.
I think in the early days of our work, we realized that just talking about, because we're a rights-based group, so we talk a lot about human rights, and but just talking about it, talking about things from a rights-based perspective in a culture and a society that doesn't really accept or understands human rights can be difficult. So how we strategically tried to deal with that was really to tell stories. Yeah, and then link that up to rights violations and human rights issues. So we found that that kind of strategy worked. And it was also, instead of outrightly criticizing, for instance, a particular policy which might get you into trouble, we let the story speak for itself, yeah, and show how policy, say, for instance, has failed this particular person, and that is understood through this person's experiences, his hardship, etc. So that was how we approached the advocacy, especially when we started out in the early years. When we did the Day Off campaign, for instance, I think there was one instance when we realized that we had kind of crossed a boundary, yeah, which is quite ironic now because they are featuring the Day Off campaign in the social studies textbook. And I saw that in the newspapers yesterday. But when the campaign was started, the Manpower Ministry and the Home Affairs Ministry wanted to meet all of us, and they didn't want us to do it, yeah, because they said that it was a very sensitive issue. There would be there were security concerns. I had no idea what kind of security concerns there could be from just campaigning for a weekly day off. But one of the things they said was that because this was a controversial issue, it would split the Singaporean public, and we don't want that. It will cause divisions. Yeah, so that happens for a lot of issues, whether it's LGBT, etc. So as long as they see a socially divisive issue, and you are pushing hard on it, they will classify that as a security concern. Yeah, so there were a lot of activities that we planned that they didn't want us to do, but we had to negotiate with them, and they said that okay, we are not going to stop you from doing this. You can do it, but you have to do it on terms that we can accept. Yeah, so then we had to modify the campaign, and of course in the whole process, because it wasn't just Home that was involved, there were other groups, TWC2, UN Women. So also managing each organization's boundaries and each other's spheres and all that was also a challenge. Yeah, but in the end the campaign still went ahead. Yeah, but it's just that we had to take into consideration the things which they were not happy about. Yeah, and there were of course a lot of debates about whether we were compromising, blah blah blah, etc. Yeah, but we did in the end come to a consensus about how we were going to deal with the issue.